When the armed hijackers took control of the cruise ship's bridge and held 4,200 passengers hostage 200 miles from shore, rescue was impossible and negotiations had failed. But the ship's security supervisor implementing tactical response wasn't just following maritime protocol. He was a former Navy SEAL whose hostage rescue training had taught him to neutralize threats when there was nowhere to run. For 8 years, Jake Morrison had been the invisible protector aboard the luxury cruise ship Ocean Paradise. As head of security for Royal Caribbean's flagship vessel, he oversaw the safety of up to 4,200 passengers and 1,400 crew members during 7-day voyages through international waters. To the vacationing families and honeymooning couples, he was simply Jake, the professional security supervisor who somehow made maritime safety look effortless even during the busiest cruise seasons. What they didn't know was that Jake carried credentials that would have shocked the entire cruise industry. Hidden in his secure cabin was a Navy discharge certificate documenting 12 years with the Navy SEALs, including specialized training in maritime assault, hostage rescue, and ship-to-ship combat operations. The same eyes that now monitored passenger decks had once conducted classified operations in hostile waters, where split-second decisions determined whether missions succeeded or teams never came home. Those 12 years had taken Jake through some of the most dangerous maritime operations in military history. Navy SEALs were specialists in underwater infiltration, shipboarding procedures, and combat in confined spaces where traditional military tactics didn't apply. Jake had boarded hostile vessels in the Persian Gulf, conducted hostage rescues on hijacked ships, and learned to fight in the cramped corridors and narrow passages that defined maritime combat. The transition from Navy SEAL to cruise ship security had been more relevant than most people would expect. Both jobs required understanding maritime threats, coordinating with international authorities, and protecting people in isolated environments where help could be hours or days away. The main difference was that cruise passengers were seeking relaxation rather than avoiding enemy contact. But Jake knew that the ocean could turn any situation dangerous in minutes. The Ocean Paradise was a floating city that presented unique security challenges. At 1,200 feet long and carrying over 5,000 people, the ship operated in international waters where traditional law enforcement had limited jurisdiction. The vessel's multiple decks, complex layout, and isolated location created conditions where any security incident could become catastrophic if not properly managed. Jake had noticed concerning intelligence reports from maritime security briefings. Somali pirate activity had increased in shipping lanes that the Ocean Paradise traveled, and terrorist organizations had specifically mentioned cruise ships as potential targets for high-profile attacks. The combination of thousands of civilians, limited escape routes, and international media attention made cruise vessels attractive targets for anyone seeking maximum impact. Tonight's cruise was particularly concerning. The Ocean Paradise was carrying 4,200 passengers, near maximum capacity, and traveling through waters where pirate activity had been reported within the past month. Jake had implemented additional security protocols and positioned his team based on threat assessments that combined maritime intelligence with his Navy SEAL experience. What worried Jake wasn't the normal cruise activities. It was the perfect storm of factors that could turn a vacation into a hostage crisis. High passenger density, remote location, and the kind of international waters where pirates operated with impunity. The first sign of trouble came at 2:30 a.m. when Jake's radar operator detected a fast-moving vessel approaching from the southeast. The boat was traveling at 35 knots, too fast for fishing and on an intercept course with the Ocean Paradise. Jake's Navy SEAL training immediately identified the approach pattern as hostile reconnaissance. Jake activated the ship's security alert system and began implementing what the Navy called Maritime Threat Response, protocols designed to protect vessels under potential attack in international waters. His team moved to predetermined positions throughout the ship, while Jake coordinated with the bridge to alter course and increase speed. At 3:15 a.m., the approaching vessel made contact via radio with demands that confirmed Jake's worst fears. The boat contained armed hijackers who were ordering the Ocean Paradise to stop engines and prepare for boarding. Their English was accented but professional, suggesting this wasn't their first maritime operation. Jake realized he was facing the scenario that Navy SEAL training had prepared him for, but that civilian crew security wasn't equipped to handle. The hijackers were demanding access to the ship, and refusal would likely result in armed assault against a vessel carrying over 5,000 innocent people. Working with Captain Rodriguez, Jake began implementing defensive measures that went far beyond standard crew security protocols. His Navy SEAL experience had taught him that maritime hijackings followed predictable patterns, and the Ocean Paradise needed to be prepared for escalating threats. At 3:30 a.m., the situation deteriorated rapidly. 2 additional fast boats appeared on radar, and radio communications revealed that the hijackers had detailed knowledge of the ship's layout, passenger capacity, and security procedures. This wasn't an opportunistic attack. It was a planned operation targeting the Ocean Paradise specifically. Jake activated emergency protocols and began preparing the ship's crew for what Navy doctrine called hostile boarding procedures. But he knew that traditional maritime security wasn't designed for the kind of coordinated assault that appeared to be developing. At 3:47 a.m., the hijackers made their move. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously. The hijackers had studied the Ocean Paradise's design and identified multiple boarding points that would allow them to access different levels of the ship while overwhelming security response. Jake watched through security cameras as armed men in tactical gear began climbing aboard using professional maritime assault equipment. Jake's Navy SEAL training immediately kicked in. This was a coordinated military-style operation, not a random pirate attack. The hijackers moved with the precision of people who had conducted similar operations before, and their equipment suggested they had significant financial backing and operational planning. Within minutes, the hijackers had taken control of the ship's bridge, cutting off communication with maritime authorities and disabling the GPS tracking that would allow rescue forces to locate the Ocean Paradise. Captain Rodriguez and his senior officers were being held at gunpoint, while the hijackers began implementing what appeared to be a well-rehearsed takeover plan. Jake realized that the 4,200 passengers sleeping below deck had no idea they were now hostages in a maritime crisis that could end with mass casualties. The hijackers' next move would be securing passenger areas and using the civilians as leverage against any rescue attempts. But the hijackers had made a critical error in their intelligence gathering. They knew the Ocean Paradise's layout, security procedures, and crew capabilities. But they didn't know that their primary opposition wasn't just cruise ship security. It was a former Navy SEAL whose maritime combat training had prepared him for exactly this scenario. Jake began implementing what the Navy called shipboard defense protocols, using his knowledge of the vessel's design and his SEAL training to mount resistance against the hostile takeover. His goal wasn't just protecting passengers, it was creating conditions where a rescue operation could succeed without massive civilian casualties. Moving through the ship's service corridors, Jake began what SEALs called internal reconnaissance, gathering intelligence about the hijackers' positions, capabilities, and objectives while remaining undetected. The narrow passages and complex layout that made the ship vulnerable to attack also provided advantages for someone trained in close-quarters combat. Jake's initial assessment was sobering. The hijackers had at least 12 armed members positioned throughout critical areas of the ship. They carried military-grade weapons and communication equipment, and their tactical coordination suggested extensive planning and professional training. But Jake also identified weaknesses in their operation that his SEAL experience allowed him to exploit. Jake began implementing what Navy SEALs called maritime guerrilla tactics, using the ship's environment to neutralize individual threats while avoiding direct confrontation that could endanger passengers. His 12 years of SEAL training had included extensive work in ship-to-ship combat and hostage rescue operations. His first target was the hijacker team controlling the ship's communication center. Jake used ventilation shafts and maintenance passages to approach their position without detection, applying infiltration techniques he'd learned during classified operations. The confined space and the hijackers' focus on monitoring external communications gave Jake the tactical advantage he needed. The encounter lasted less than 30 seconds. Using silent takedown techniques developed for maritime operations, Jake neutralized 2 hijackers and regained control of the communication center without alerting other members of the boarding party. He immediately sent emergency signals to maritime rescue authorities, providing GPS coordinates and tactical intelligence about the hijacking. But Jake knew that rescue was still hours away, and the remaining hijackers would soon discover that their communication team was compromised. He needed to continue degrading their operational capabilities while protecting the thousands of innocent people who were now trapped in a floating crisis zone. Jake's second objective was the engine room, where hijackers were attempting to disable the ship's propulsion and maneuvering capabilities. Using his knowledge of naval engineering and shipboard systems, Jake approached through maintenance areas that the hijackers hadn't secured. The engine room confrontation was more challenging. 3 armed hijackers were positioned to control the ship's power and propulsion systems, and their tactical positioning made silent approach impossible. Jake had to rely on close-quarters combat techniques designed for the cramped industrial environment of ship engine compartments. Using distraction and tactical movement, Jake engaged the hijacker team in a firefight that demonstrated the difference between criminal training and Navy SEAL expertise. Within 10 minutes, Jake had secured the engine room and restored the ship's maneuvering capability, giving rescue forces a mobile target rather than a disabled vessel. But the most dangerous phase of the operation was still ahead. The remaining hijackers had taken defensive positions near passenger areas, and any direct assault could result in civilian casualties that would turn a successful rescue into a humanitarian disaster. The final phase of Jake's operation required implementing what Navy SEALs called precision hostage rescue, neutralizing armed threats while ensuring 0 civilian casualties in a confined environment where conventional tactics couldn't be applied. Jake's SEAL training had included extensive work in exactly this scenario: armed hostiles using innocent civilians as human shields in spaces where explosive breaches or overwhelming force would cause unacceptable collateral damage. The solution required surgical precision and perfect tactical execution. Using the ship's internal communication system, Jake began psychological operations designed to separate the hijackers from their hostages. He provided information about the tactical situation that convinced the remaining hijackers that their operation had failed and their best option was negotiated surrender rather than a firefight that would end with their deaths. The technique worked. 3 of the remaining hijackers agreed to release their hostages in exchange for safe passage off the ship. Jake coordinated the exchanges using negotiation skills he'd learned during SEAL training, ensuring that civilians were moved to safety before any tactical action resumed. But the hijacker leader and 2 associates refused negotiation and threatened to begin executing passengers if their demands weren't met. Jake realized he was facing the scenario that SEAL training classified as no negotiation hostage rescue, a situation where armed intervention was the only option that would prevent mass casualties. Jake implemented a coordinated assault that utilized every aspect of his Navy SEAL training. Using flashbang grenades and tactical movement, he created enough confusion to separate the hijackers from their hostages while engaging them in close-quarters combat that ended the threat without civilian injuries. When the U.S. Navy rescue team arrived 2 hours later, they found Jake coordinating medical treatment for injured crew members while maintaining security over detained hijackers. The Ocean Paradise was secure, all passengers were safe, and the hijacking had been resolved without the mass casualties that typically characterized maritime terrorist attacks. Captain Rodriguez, who had been held hostage during the initial assault, asked Jake how he had managed to defeat a professional hijacking team while protecting thousands of civilians. "Navy SEALs," Jake replied. 12 years of maritime operations and hostage rescue. Same mission, different ocean. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of what Jake had prevented. The hijackers weren't random pirates. They were part of an international terrorist organization that had specifically targeted the Ocean Paradise for a mass casualty attack designed to damage the cruise industry and create international headlines. FBI maritime terrorism experts explained that the hijackers' plan had included demands for ransom payments, but intelligence suggested their ultimate objective was creating a maritime disaster that would result in hundreds of deaths and massive media coverage. Jake's intervention had prevented what could have become the deadliest terrorist attack against American civilians since 9/11. The successful resolution of the Ocean Paradise hijacking became a case study for maritime security agencies worldwide. Jake's tactical response demonstrated how military expertise could be applied to civilian vessel protection in ways that traditional security couldn't match. Royal Caribbean, recognizing that Jake had saved both lives and the company's reputation, offered him the position of Director of Maritime Security for their entire fleet. The cruise industry also implemented new security protocols based on Jake's Navy SEAL training for high-risk voyages. But perhaps the most significant recognition came from the U.S. Navy, which invited Jake to develop training programs for civilian maritime security based on his successful application of SEAL tactics to cruise ship protection. His expertise bridged the gap between military special operations and civilian maritime safety. Jake remained with Royal Caribbean as their maritime security director, but his role had evolved beyond traditional cruise ship safety. He became a consultant for the international maritime industry on terrorist threats, helping other cruise lines develop security protocols that could detect and defeat the kind of coordinated attacks that had targeted the Ocean Paradise. During peaceful voyages, when passengers enjoyed their vacations without knowing how close they'd come to becoming victims of international terrorism, Jake still patrolled the ship with the same tactical awareness he'd brought to SEAL operations. But now he understood something that had taken him years to learn. Protecting people didn't require military authorization or special operations missions. Sometimes the most important SEAL work happened in places where nobody expected to find a former Navy special operator, places where terrorist attacks were prevented before they could succeed, where families could vacation safely because someone with extraordinary training chose to use those skills to protect ordinary people from extraordinary threats. Jake Morrison had spent 12 years conducting Navy SEAL operations in the world's most dangerous waters. Now he spent his time ensuring that cruise passengers could enjoy the ocean without fear, knowing that someone with the training and commitment to defeat maritime terrorists was watching. And in the end, he realized both missions were exactly the same, using elite military skills to protect innocent people from those who would harm them, ensuring that good people could pursue happiness without fear of those who sought to destroy it.